And today, specifically, we're going to be talking to our new friend, Mitchell O'Neill, who I'll let introduce himself a little bit more properly, but essentially an invasive species biologist with the New York Natural Heritage Program, which runs the New York version of the iMapInvasives program. So I'll go ahead and drop my screen share briefly so that you can get a better look at Mitchell and get a proper introduction. Hi, Mitchell.
Hi everyone. Yeah, so should I talk a little bit about what I do to
Sure,
start?
yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so my name is Mitchell O'Neill, um, and I'm an invasive species biologist with the New York Natural Heritage Program. And so what that means is that I work with a team of people at our heritage program that manage invasive species data for New York State. And so we have partners across the state who do various forms of invasive species work. So perhaps people who manage state parks, people who manage nature preserves, other state agencies and nonprofits, and even lots of citizen scientists as well. Um, and so those people are kind of doing all of the on the ground work, like going into an area and surveying for invasives, maybe pulling invasives. And uh, our goal is to provide them with tools for documenting what they're doing, and mapping what they're doing, and also providing tools for analyzing that information. So my role as the biologist, one of the things I do is keep our invasive species list up to date. So keeping track of new invasive species in kind of the Northeast, and also developing some of those analyses. So if you imagine lots of people mapping invasives, so now we have this big map of New York State with a million little points on it. That's great to have that information, but it's also overwhelming. Like, what do you kind of do with all that? So one of my jobs is working with partners to develop maps and analyses that kind of convert that really complicated information into some more distilled down insights and uh, basically like prioritization tools to help people kind of hone in on like which invasive species are perhaps priorities. How do you tackle different invasive species? Which areas in your, like, maybe if you're looking at a park, maybe which areas within that park are kind of the key areas to address invasives, kind of that sort of stuff. And one thing I also want to mention kind of early on. So I said we manage the invasive species data for New York State. And so in New York, we use iMapInvasives as our database. There are several other states that use that as well. I saw someone in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania uses IMAP as well. Um, but mapping invasives is also a much bigger issue that it goes beyond state boundaries. It's kind of happening everywhere. So some of these places use iMapInvasives like New York, but there are other databases as well. So EdMaps is a big one, which we'll mention later. Um, but all these different databases, we are kind of talking to each other, and we have goals of streamlining data sharing in the future. So we'll talk a little bit more of that in the later on, but I just wanted to put that out there at the beginning. So it's kind of this effort that happens everywhere, but most of my examples will be New York biased. So examples of what I do in New York, but just know that similar things may be happening in your area as well.
And I'm really glad you mentioned that because I'm writing down a note for myself later. I noticed on the IMAP site ways in which someone could reach out about adding a state, and so we might want to talk about that later if we have time, because I believe that's still an option, right?
Yeah, 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 sure.
Awesome. And then you mentioned something that I didn't realize, but since you are mapping, you are the biologist actually looking at the data. You mentioned adding invasive species to the list. Has there been a recent addition of note lately that we've had to add? I'm smiling, but it's a bummer.
Yeah, yeah.
But
One thing, so the some people out of the New York Botanical Garden, yeah, NYBG, they've been working on this new manual for identifying plants in the Northeast. And in doing all of that work, one of the, like, so they've been looking at they've been doing field work. They've been looking at herbarium records, all sorts of things. I'm not even sure everything they've been looking at, but one of the things that came out of that work was that they realized they identified these, I think, 5 plant species which have started popping up in the Northeast, and they have started spreading, but they're still pretty early on. They're not common, and so they're calling them emerging invasives. And I could find a link to that to send you. But so I've been looking through those new species, and so an example of one is, let me think of a good one to
Only the
share.
coolest named one, clearly.
Okay, maybe Euonymus hamiltonianus. It's also
What?
called Hamilton's spindle. Um, so it's closely related to another very common invasive species, Euonymus alatus, or burning bush. So it's a pretty common landscape plant which has escaped and kind of spreads in natural areas. This is just another species of that same genus, and it's really pretty. And we don't know much about it yet, so it's kind of one to keep an eye out on, to see if it's causing negative impacts. So far, it's kind of behaving like a lot of other invasive species and kind of forming these big monocultures. So that's one to keep an eye out on, but we don't know much about it yet, which is why we need people looking for these species and mapping them.
Yeah, definitely. I will have to look up what those look like for you all later and add them to our follow-up email. I wrote them down. We should be good. Also, burning bush was the other one, right? It's
Mhm.
not emerging, but it's similar to the
Yeah,
emerging
and I
species.
guess that's more of a. So of course I'm New York biased. Like these plants probably won't survive in Arizona and Nevada, and there's different species there. But for Northeast people, most of these species are probably relevant.
Right, yeah. And for anyone who is in the Southwest, the one I can offer you offhand is the stink net. It's terrible. Anyway, so it's my one claim to fame with knowing invasive species. So before we go into more about what invasive species are and whatnot, we want to make sure that you all are recognized for what you already do if you are involved, especially for anyone who is already a naturalist. We want to know, have you ever participated in invasive species removal or management? Are you familiar with being like a volunteer on a project through a national park, for example, or anything of the like? We'd love to know. And we'll give you a couple more seconds. Oh, yay, we made it past 80%. All right, couple more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, I guess we're staying at 80%. Awesome. So we're at yes is about 60 or 56%, no 22%, maybe question mark 22% as well. So for you maybes, we'll try to describe some of those examples of how one might participate in that. So you'll hear later if that does equate to what you've done. And for those of you, especially those of you who are ambassadors, is this of interest as something that you want to do an event for or program, help learn how to do an event to make this happen? Or maybe not at all, you just want to participate as a volunteer, and that's totally okay too. We're just curious. We want to know how to best support you if this does relate to you. How are we feeling about that? I'll give you another 5-ish seconds. We're at 72%. Maybe get to 80. Just need maybe 2 more people. Not feeling it? All right. That's fine too. Oh, yay. Okay, good. We got to 81. I'll give you a second. 3, 2, 1. All right, sticking at 80%. All right, so we got 56%. Oh, that's funny. The exact same. So yeses are most of you, but then also no's and maybes for the other half of you, essentially. Awesome. Okay, so that's good to know. If you need, beyond this event, if there ever comes a time where you need more information on these things, we can start developing resources for you too. All right, and then lastly, if you are one of those yeses who have participated or anything you want to mention about your involvement in a program like this, feel free to drop it in the chat for us. We'd love to know what you're already up to. I will push us forward into the next slide in a moment here. So actually, let me just go ahead and retype it for you once we get to the next slide to make sure that you all remember. So if you are interested or if you've already done some things, in what way have you participated? In what way have you participated in the past? All right. So that's in the chat forever for now. And then you can just let us know. Just make sure that you change the drop-down menu to everyone so that everyone can see how you are involved. But if you just want to send it to us, that's fine too. It's up to you. All right, so what on earth are invasive species? We've already started talking about them, but we're going to backtrack a little bit just to make sure we're all on common ground here. So Mitchell, take it away. What are invasive species?
Yeah. So the most common definition you'll hear, and it's how I think of invasives as well, is that they are organisms, so plants, animals, microorganisms, fungi, can be anything. A lot of the time we talk about plants and animals, though. So organisms that are not native to the area, and when they are introduced, they cause some sort of harm to either environmentally or economically or human health. I'll give some examples, mostly thinking about there's a lot of room for interpretation in there. So I'll talk a little bit about how we think about it in New York, and that can kind of be applied to wherever you are. So there's that first part of species that are not native. So what that means, so for New York, when we're talking about native species, those are the plants and animals and other organisms that have existed in the region for thousands of years. They've been co-evolving together, forming these really wonderful ecological communities. And so the not native species, those are species that are newer additions. So they were not here before European settlement, and they were brought here through human activity. So sometimes that's on purpose, like we brought multiflora rose over because we thought it was really pretty and has nice flowers. And that all went well for a little bit, but then it started escaping from people's yards, and now it's in our forests as well, and it crowds out other species. But we also have brought species over accidentally. So you can imagine an insect lands on a ship somewhere overseas, and then suddenly 3 days later, now that insect has been introduced to a new continent. So that kind of stuff happens as well. But that's just one part of the definition. So that's the not native part. So there are lots and lots of not native species anywhere you go. And most of them are not a problem. So we're not worried about the majority of non-native species. It's just a small subset of those species which cause problems. And so that's when it becomes invasives. And some examples, so for an example of economic harm, that top left picture, that's a spotted lanternfly. And so that's, yeah, some of you might have heard of that one. It feeds on a lot of different plants, but the main impact is that it can really decimate vineyards, so grapevines. So that has an economic impact, especially in states like New York and Pennsylvania. If California got spotted lanternfly, that would be a problem too. So that's an example of economic harm. On the right side, the big picture is a hemlock forest. Hemlocks are a native tree in a lot of North America. Really important. It's one of the more common species in New York State. So you can imagine a forest of hemlocks and how many insects and animals and even they even shade streams and make them cooler through that shade, and that makes them more hospitable to species of brook trout. So there's like all these different organisms that find habitat in the hemlocks and feed on hemlocks. So hemlocks are very important. And then there's an invasive pest called the hemlock woolly adelgid, which our trees have not evolved to deal with before. So once these hemlock woolly adelgids arrived, those are now killing hemlocks, and that kind of like opens up that area, and that habitat for those native species is not there anymore. So that's an example of an environmental impact. And I don't have a picture of a human health impact, but one example would be like there's giant hogweed, which is an invasive plant which causes really bad rashes. And that other example on there is water chestnut. So it's not the water chestnut That's in Asian cuisine. It's a different species of plant, um, but it forms mats on the water, and so that has ecological impacts. But also, you can't get your boat through it anymore, which is a recreational impact. It could be like an emergency access issue as well. Um, so those are some examples of invasives, and I just want to reiterate, like, um, it's not about being against all non-native species or like wanting to keep all of our ecosystems exactly the same and not let there be any new species. That's really not the mindset. It's more um, monitoring how our ecosystems are changing, and when there's these new species which are having significant impacts, we have to recognize that, and we have to think about potential actions that might prevent the negative impacts that that species has happened, or at least reduce those negative impacts. Um, so yeah, I hope that kind of gave you an idea of what invasive species are.
Yeah, absolutely. I myself have recalled many a time stomping on spotted lanternflies on my in the courtyard area of where I live. Uh,
Mm.
they congregate around the door and are surprisingly difficult to squash. They're very quick to like jump away very suddenly. I don't know if anyone else has had to get rid of spotted lanternflies near where you live, but oh my goodness, they're gross. And we have a couple of examples in our chat too that I just wanted to mention. Kelly, the our DNR hosts stewardship Saturdays at different state parks involving invasive species removal. Totally. I see that you've mentioned that. Are you a part of one of those groups? Yeah. And then Helen also, Japanese knotweed removal. It's an ongoing process in clearing trails of multiflora rose and other vine-type plants with Parks and Recreation Department and local natural lands group. Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone's looking for where to participate, a lot of national parks and recreational departments too. Scrape the egg mass. Oh, thank you for mentioning that. For the lanternfly, spotted lanternfly, you also need to scrape the egg masses. I don't know if I've seen one, but that's a good thing to look out for next time I see them hopping around.
Yeah.
Uh, they seem so slow, and then you try to squish them, and they're like, "Wait, I want to live." Really? All right, fine then. All right, I will let you take it over again with this page.
Yeah, and I'll I'll just cover this really briefly, but we could talk more if questions come about it. But like, just one issue near and dear to my heart is also how invasive species impact biodiversity. And so one of the ways is, with they kind of affect those really important keystone species or foundation species like hemlock, like so really common species that provide habitat for lots of other species. But also invasive species can directly impact a lot of our rare, threatened, and endangered species. So these are just three examples of some rare plants in New York State which have invasives kind of co-occurring with them. And in all these cases, it's like a very common invasive species, which is kind of pretty widespread. And we know we're never going to get rid of that species. Like we can't just get rid of all the knotweed in New York State because there's too much of it and it will always come back. But maybe in these specific locations where the invasive species is encroaching on some rare or endangered species, it might be worth managing it at that site, and just know that it will be like a continuous process of going back each year and seeing if it comes back. But you can still kind of make a difference on these local levels, even when you know a species is too common to like completely get rid of it from your entire region.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The whole idea of local matters. So
Yes.
I mean, especially considering the species will change depending on where you are.
Yep.
Uh, but yeah, yeah, local matters. And the idea that you have to keep coming back every year is something that I often forget about. Like when it's invasive species removal, I'm like, okay, well, it's been removed.
Yeah, we did it.
We did it. We're done. Not really.
Yeah.
I was thinking that's what was happening in Arizona with the stink net, and then I'd be around and see it everywhere, and I'm like, oh, we didn't get rid of it. We didn't actually like mean to get rid of it either. It's kind of a
Yeah.
thing to do. Absolutely. It makes you think a lot about how wrong the survival of the strongest is. Like even though that's like they'll be strong and they'll expand, it doesn't mean that that's necessarily a good thing, and we don't
Right.
want to be like strongest only survive. It's
Yeah.
the diversity really matters with these ecosystems. All right, I'm going to flip the page. So in terms of goals, we've talked a lot about like what the general goals are, but when you talk about your job too and what your primary focuses are, what does the goal look like for all invasive species management and removal?
Yeah. So the goals kind of, I guess the overall goal is that we want to like minimize negative impacts to the things we like, whether that be our economies or our environment or our human health. And so, what that looks like what the specific goals are, will kind of vary for species. And one framework that I know we use it a lot in New York State and it's used a lot elsewhere as well is this idea of the invasion curve. So if you think of like a species and how its invasion occurs, so at first the invasive species is not here, and so at that point, the strategy would be to prevent that species from arriving. Um, but once it does arrive, once it's still just a couple of populations, it might be possible to actually remove that species and not have to deal with it anymore. Um, but if you don't get it really fast in that first couple of years, it will kind of expand beyond the point where that's possible. And then in that point, we'll be in the containment phase. So that's often just trying to not let it spread from where it is currently. So maybe surveying near the known populations, and if there's like little plants that pop up, take those out, even if you can't, even if the like source population is like too much for you to be able to manage. And once it gets past that containment phase, and if it hasn't been contained, one of the ways we describe that is long-term management. So that's something, or asset-based protection. So that's one example would be those common invasive plants that were displacing the rare species in the slide I just had. So like those are species where they're everywhere. So you might be, yeah. So it's like you might be managing it in places where there's some particular reason that you need to manage it. Like you get rid of this invasive aquatic plant because it's causing issues in that area, but you can't like just get rid of it from everywhere. And so if you go back to the curve, um, uh, so one kind of where the mapping component comes in is to do anything about a species, we need to know where it is, and also we need some idea of where it is on the curve. So if a species is in that long-term management, and you're trying to eradicate it, like that's not going to work. So by having these mapping options and people are out there surveying, then we have that data on where species are and we can try to figure out where they are on this invasion curve. And also the mapping can help us. We want to stay at the earlier end of the curve as much as we can. Like we want to get invasive species early on in their invasion because the effort to do something about them and the potential benefits are like, well, the effort is lower and the potential benefits are higher, if you're getting things early. So by having people out there looking for invasives and entering them into a database, that can help us catch things early, pretty much.
I'm even thinking about the use of citizen scientists later on, which we'll talk about soon. It's low cost like action, right? Like we don't it's volunteer work, and so being able to control how many resources are put into something that's just like a wicked problem. It's a big issue. That's why citizen scientists are super helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Yeah.
as we're scrambling for years and years trying to figure out like how to manage something or what we can do about it, if in the background we've been mapping it all this time and we know where it is, that's really helpful for when new techniques arise, and we know where it is so we can try to apply those techniques to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we move on from this slide, I was curious what about so when we talk about prevention, when we have so many species across the planet and knowing like something is not there, is there like is there a more defined version of what species we're looking to prevent, or is it literally just like any species that's non-native coming over? We're just like a general, what are the preventative measures that
Yeah,
are?
that's a really good question. Like sometimes it's species specific, like your state might have a do not plant list or something, like it might ban the sale of certain species which are harmful. But there are limits to that. Like you can't ban 5,000 species because that's crazy, or something like that. So there
Yeah.
are also like some general things that are encouraged. So one, you could go to a website called Play Clean Go. So that's they kind of promote this idea that people are you're hiking, you're doing whatever, like be conscientious that moving from place to place, you could be unintentionally, you could have invasive plant seeds in the treads of your boots. So like you could brush your boots off. Another another common phrase is clean, drain, dry. That pertains to boats and kayaks and that sort of stuff. So invasive species can be moved around if you're like taking a boat out of one water body, putting it in another. So if you clean the boat in between, that can reduce a lot of that risk. And we're never going to get the risk down to zero. It's just kind of reducing the spread a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually going to ask about where to find those preventive measures. So that's really helpful. The Play Clean Go. I'll add that to the follow-up email. Anyone who's like, oh no, I
Nice.
need to know what that is. Absolutely. Oh, another example in the chat. Zebra mussels have infected all lakes in Texas. Ugh, that's not good. I didn't know those were invasive, but that's the other question, which we'll hit later on. I just was curious, as we learn more, the best ways to find the most local version of your list of invasives to be on the lookout
Yeah.
for, including the no plant list, of course, but that's like to the point where it's already needing to be contained or there's a need to eradicate where those lists might be. But I know we'll have more opportunities to talk about that. So let's
Okay.
move forward for now. And talk about who the citizen scientists are. Who's your community of practice? Citizen scientists, researchers, what's the ecosystem like?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so like one part is the kind of professional conservationist type people. So people who are the managers of their land or their waters, and they are doing invasive species work. There's also academic researchers that use our data. And in New York, we have these partnerships for regional invasive species management. It's PRISMs, and there are these organizations that kind of lead invasive species efforts in their regions of the state. For other parts of U.S., some other parts use that same acronym, PRISMs, but there are other types of that same kind of thing as well. Like there's cooperative weed management areas out west, CWMAs, and there's all sorts of different acronyms similar to that. So there might be something similar in your area as well. So so that's like a big example of users of the database. So people who are looking at the database to see if new invasive species are being reported in their area so that they can go and manage it on their preserve or their park. And then so kind of all those professional groups, but then also those people, like there's only so many of us. We can't monitor every inch of the state. We're often limited to prioritizing certain areas. We're not going to get to some of the more remote areas, for example, or private lands. So we really rely on a big network of general public, community scientists as well, to kind of help us cover this area. Um, yeah, I think that was all. I had some
That's all
examples
the people.
of, oh, what were you going to say?
I just was thinking like, what other people are we missing? Someone's gonna be like, why didn't you mention me? But I don't
Oh,
know
yeah,
who.
yeah,
Yeah, they're good. I
yeah,
mean,
all
if
kinds
any
of
of you,
people.
it sounds like a bunch of you are involved in various things. If you have like your go-to folks or like the organizations that support, feel free to drop them in the chat too for different examples of them. For example, Lisa just dropped into the chat. Our local Master Gardener program helps the local invasive monitor local invasive plant and plant pest species, which is awesome.
Nice.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm almost tempted to ask about pesticides right now because I'm wondering if that has any impact on any of this, but I didn't warn you about that question. Does that have anything to do with the work that you do?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, there's many different for like any infestation. Um, it's a big complex problem to tackle, and there's a bunch of different techniques you might consider. So in that picture on the bottom right, they're putting wire mesh over Japanese knotweed. So they've cut the knotweed and disposed of it safely because even if you have a tiny piece of Japanese knotweed, it can like grow into a whole new plant. So when it's removed, it has to be done like very carefully. You can't just like cut it up and throw it in a pile or something. Um, but they've cut it and they've put this wire mesh on it. So when it tries to grow back up, it girdles itself. So that's like an example of physical. The other example in there is a person pulling plants out of the water. So pulling, like physically removing plants. Um, but another tool in people's tool belt is using pesticides in some way. And that's never anyone's like first choice. And if it is used, it's usually done a very specific way. So it's not just like spraying herbicides everywhere or something. It's maybe a specific time where you spray it on this plant, but the other plants aren't out yet, so it doesn't affect them. Or you're kind of with knotweed, you're often injecting chemicals into that specific plant, like with a syringe. So it's yeah. So like the word herbicide sometimes is scary, but it is one of the tools that people use to manage invasive species, and the idea is that like the long term benefit is going to outweigh the fact that we have to use these chemicals.
Yeah, that's fast. I did not realize we had folks going around with syringes injecting plants. The image is kind of funny to be like that sounds like a very like not ineffective per se, but like so granular per plant, unless
Yeah,
it's only for like small instances of plants. But that's that's got to be a fun process to do.
yeah.
And it looks like we had someone agreeing with you on like the timing is super critical for using specific herbicides to treat knotweed. Absolutely. Hell, I'm so glad you're so knowledgeable about this stuff.
Oh,
Uh,
and Kelly gave another good example. That's like similar to the prisms or the CWMAs. There's also SISMAs. That's another big one. Cooperative invasive species management areas.
awesome. And it looks like we have a strike team too, New Jersey Invasive Species Strike Team. I want to be on that team. You kidding me? Garden volunteer at North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and all of us help remove blackberry. Just blackberry plants? I didn't realize blackberry plants were invasive. That's so sad. I love blackberry.
There's lots of different species. It's like there's rubus is the genus. There's lots of different blackberries and raspberries all within that genus, and some of them are. I mean, it depends where you are, but I know there's some that are native where I am, so there's probably some native where you are as well. But then there are also some invasive varieties as well.
Makes sense. Thanks for sharing that, Jessica. Garden volunteer. Yeah, all kinds of groups. Wow. All right, so now that we talked about what all this is and some of the methods and such, let's get into like what is this actually accomplishing? So with the use of citizen scientists, with the use of databases like iMapInvasives, which we'll discuss on how to use along with all the other tools that might exist, what are we actually learning as we move through that?
Yeah. So in that first bullet, I just put the so look, and this is mostly in the jurisdictions that actively use IMAP, so the states and provinces that have lots of IMAP data. Um, but like one just really granular or one really broad thing is that we have this almost 1.5 million observations of invasive species. So one thing we've learned, which we probably already know, is that there's lots of invasive species all around. But then to look at it more as some New York based examples, so by having this data set of where invasive species are, we can also cross reference that with our database of rare, threatened, and endangered plant and animal populations. So actually, to step back a little bit for the New York Natural Heritage Program. We're one of many natural heritage programs across the country. So pretty much every state and province has one. And the main thing that we do is track rare, threatened, and endangered plant and animal populations. Um, but it was recognized years ago that invasive species are a really important concern when it comes to these rare, threatened, and endangered plant species. And so, like 10 years ago, it was a group of natural heritage programs that led to the creation of iMap. So that's kind of part of our history. And so we're focused on invasive species, but it's not because we hate invasives or something. It's because we love biodiversity and we want to protect it, and we want to map things like invasive species so that we can protect rare species and biodiversity and everything. So sorry, that was a tangent, but one of the things, so since we have that data and the invasives data, we can look at that together. And one thing we found was that over 20% of our rare species populations overlap with invasive species populations. It could be higher than that. That's just based on the data we have. So that sort of information is useful to know. And so we can flag locations where there are invasives and rare species near each other to kind of prioritize which out of the millions of points we should go to and try to do something about.
It looks like, and on this graph,
Yep.
sorry, I'm you ahead, but I'm stuck on the idea of the 65% being unknown. So,
Yeah.
do you want to just talk?
Yeah. So another thing so we have this database, people are recording where invasive species are, people record management efforts, like if they're doing a herbicide treatment or a plant pull, and then they collect data after it as well. And so we have this information on where species were, where they were treated, and how abundant they are after the treatment. And so with that look through time, we can see whether our actions are actually working. Like, we are doing this management, do all the species just come back, or are we keeping on top of it and actually reducing invasives and paving the way for native species to be very abundant and healthy. And so, yeah, as you see on that graph, for the cases where we do have enough information to kind of make that call, in most cases, yes, we are that green compared to the yellow and the red. So in most cases where we have information, our efforts appear to be going in the right direction. But in 2/3 of the cases where we've recorded management, we don't have enough information yet to even know if we are successful. So that points to us needing to make sure we go back to sites and get that follow-up data, which is hard to do because people are often, on to the next site, which really needs their attention as well. So it's hard to go back to the site where you already put so much effort into getting rid of the invasives, but it is really important. So this gives us useful information on what we need to do better at recording, kind of.
Yeah, it makes me think that's its own strike team of those who are available to go back to these sites.
Yeah, and as you can see, we have all those gray points on the map, so we know where these places are where we don't have enough information, so that those gray points can become places to direct people to do surveys.
Definitely. And for sake of time, I'll go to the next slide, but we'll be skipping over to how to use the iMap site. So
we can skip this.
Oh.
This one's essentially just we use that iMap data to run the spatial analysis to put it into those 4 categories I talked about earlier. But I don't need to harp on that. That's just another example of using the data to learn things.
Now, this is for you all to look into to determine how awesome these data collection pieces are. Should I skip to the next one, or do you want to go over this?
I could do this one quick too, just since we'll talk soon about what it's like to actually submit records and stuff. Just some best practices. When you're recording an invasive species record, whether you're using iMap or EdMaps or iNaturalist, You're going to be recording the location and the date and the species. Those are kind of like the big things. Sometimes there's other information you can fill out as well, but that's all optional. The most important thing is like getting your spot on the map right and the date right and selecting a species. But one thing to note about the species is that it's actually not necessarily super important that you're correct. Like you don't have to worry too much about like knowing exactly which species it is and like becoming a botanist and figuring out all the invasives. Like if you want to do that, that's great, and we encourage you to like do your best and identify species. But really, the important thing is to include a photo, and specifically a clear photo. So on either of those examples, the one on the left is kind of either farther away or it's blurry, whereas the photo on the right is close up and clear, and you can see those distinct features. And so in all these databases, people review the submissions. So if you weren't super confident on which species it was, but you did your best and you submit it, as long as you have a clear photo, we can very easily see whether it's correct or not, and we can switch the species or whatever we need to do, and it ends up being very valuable. So don't worry too much about getting everything right, but I would say do worry about getting a good picture. So do the best you can to take a clear photo.
Excellent advice. Anyone can, that's definitely the most important thing on most citizen science projects too. So it's or related to biodiversity anyway.
Yeah.
So big deal there. So how does one participate? I actually tested this out myself, folks. So if you are looking to try iMapInvasives, it is specific jurisdictions, but you can submit from anywhere, it sounds like. Mitchell and I spoke before this to confirm that. But there are other options that we'll show you after these ones too. So I'll
Yeah.
stop talking for a moment here.
So if you're in one of these places, that means that there is a program of people who use iMapInvasives in your state. So like people will see your record come in, and it can be reviewed and stuff like that. You can submit data in other states as well. There just might not be anyone actively reviewing that. So if you're not in one of these states, you can use IMAP, but I would encourage you to kind of look around, see what's going on in your state, and submit the data the way that your state is asking or your local groups are asking. And I can talk more about that later.
Yeah. So the process for actually submitting. So I went through a test version, but it sounds like we covered most of those things in the previous slide anyway. But the taking a photo on the iMapInvasives app, it includes a like the list of species. So and then options of species detected versus not detected. If a species is this like the difference between like checking before and checking after too for those folks who are checking to see if it's like a invasive elimination strategy worked, for example, like this would be one of those tools for that
Yeah,
as well.
yeah. You could report whether it's detected or not detected, and you can fill out information like how big was the area it was covering, how dense it is, that kind of stuff.
Gotcha. Oh, so we might not even be looking at like individual plants. We might be looking at an area.
You could be, yeah. Yeah,
Oh, okay. That's good to know. Yeah. Awesome. And otherwise, it works very similarly for anyone who's familiar with iNaturalist. Honestly, I felt like it was very streamlined in the similar way. So it is a really easy app to use. And here is some instructions on how to set it up. So if you were new to it like I was, you can go to our SciStarter page for IMAP and learn like the basics of it and send it to your dashboard to save it for later. You can also create an account on the website and download the app to log in from there. I had to you create the account online before downloading the app, so it's all prepared to be on there as far as the way it set me up.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then on the mobile app, it was really nice to be able to select jurisdiction. If you do have to change your location, is that just in settings each time you change location? Like if you take a vacation
Yeah,
somewhere?
you can switch your state or province in settings later. Yeah.
Sweet. Yeah. And it even gives you this. I loved this, so I took a screenshot, even though it's a dark screenshot. Apologies for that. But it was a description of all the pieces of the app, and I found that very helpful. So when
Yeah.
you download it and see that, you'll get a better idea of how the app is designed as well. Any other things to note on how the app works?
Uh, no, I think that covers it. There are intricacies, of course, but I think like that's the basic workflow, and you can work through it.
Yeah, pretty simple. And I think, do you have an advice for like instructional support or like help pages on the
Yeah,
iMap?
there's yes, yeah, we have yeah, and on that the SciStarter page, I do have a link to like the help resources, and then there's also like on the website you can contact people to for help, that kind of thing.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, sweet. I forgot we had it on the SciStart page. Doy. And for any of you who are thinking about like future events, if you're involved in the City Nature Challenge, this might be a really unique way to prepare in advance of April is to go around and test out the IMAP invasives or tracking invasives in general too. So, and the reason I mentioned that as well is because there are other tools you can use. So, and EdMaps and WildSpotter are both by the same organization. I think it's the University, no, it's in Georgia.
Yep.
Yes. And
Yeah,
so
it's out of University of Georgia, I think.
oh, gotcha. Yes. And there's also iNaturalist. So if there are like different, depending on your state too, they can give you advice on which one they want you to use, of course. And so depending on what group you're working with, you can get guidance on there. If they're not currently using one for some reason, now you have four different options to share with them too. And do you want to say anything else about how EdMaps and WildSpotter work? I'm not as familiar with those ones, although I know they are.
It's like a similar concept to IMAP. It's kind of the same sort of thing. Doesn't work exactly the same. So like yeah, I would say just look to see what is actively used in your area. So like if you're in one of those IMAP states, I would encourage you to use IMAP, and then if your state uses EdMaps, then use EdMaps. And iNaturalist is a good option if you like if you're not sure or something, just because EdMaps and IMAP and most databases like this, they look to iNaturalist. So, for instance, if you report invasives in iNaturalist in New York State, it won't get to us as fast as if you did it directly in IMAP, but we will eventually see it. So that is a good fallback. Like if you already use iNaturalist or you're just not sure what you should be using, or if you're not sure if your state is like looking at their invasives data, it can be a good fallback. But definitely like try to see what your state's doing and consider IMAP and EdMaps first. See which one your state uses.
Awesome. Now I'm going to actually stop my screen share for a couple of questions before we close out. There were a couple questions in the chat and one that I wanted to bring back up from before, which we have a couple minutes for. So for finding unique species related to your state and location, does it makes the most sense to you to use, or in the case of using IMAP anyway, there is that like the list that it will give you of like, here's some examples of invasive species. What is your recommendation for finding the local ones that should be looked out
Yeah,
for?
good question. So for the lists in IMAP, those are kind of long. So that's like all the species that are being tracked, and that's for the participating jurisdictions. For the non-participating, those lists are very general. It's just kind of like a general North America invasive species list. So for I would definitely recommend like trying to connect with some local group. So there might be a SISMA or CWMA or PRISM or all those crazy acronyms. There might be one of those in your area, or you can look to your state's like Department of Natural Resources or Department of Environmental Conservation, uh, Parks and Recreation, like whatever those are for your state, to see what invasives are of concern. Because even in New York, like we track like 500 species, but we don't ask any. I don't know all 500. We don't ask any volunteer to to know all 500. There's often like priority lists within that, and yeah, so that's really there's it varies so much from place to place. So that's something, unfortunately, you would have to do some digging. Actually, I think that could be interesting digging to do. So, but
And I think, and I'll add it into the follow-up email if I can find
extension offices, those are good too. Sorry, continue.
Oh, extension offices. Yes.
Yeah.
We talked to an extension office person last year. And so I think she mentioned another website. It might have been connected to the Invasive Species Awareness Week program. And so there might be another jumping off point too from the federal government that might be helpful. If I can
Okay.
find it, I'll send it in the follow-up. I'm just trying to remember what it was called. And then the last question that was on here was about drones used to measure an area of invasive species. Are you aware of any strategies of using drones for
Yeah, I
that?
have heard. I've never been involved in any of that work, but that does happen. There are some people in New York who have done that, and some people elsewhere. Yeah, it is pretty cool. You
Nice,
can
cool.
kind of cover more ground, and yeah.
Right. Another use, I used a drone when looking at caterpillars and their interaction with climate change related indications because they were using the drones to do a biomass review
Oh
of
yeah.
like the area, and then they were sampling. We were not they. We were sampling the caterpillars from the plant life in that area.
Cool.
So
Very
definitely,
cool.
definitely very useful, and hopefully, I would love to do that again. The drones are quite fun. Quite
Yeah.
fun. Right? All right, awesome. So we're just at the top of the hour, so I'm going to show you what's happening next. So for any of you who are like, what's the next topic? But of course, it's household slime. Um, but of course, so we'll be talking about household slime and how it could help the planet because of those extremophiles that live within your household slime. So if you got any slime at home, and I don't mean like purposefully made, I mean like the gunk that sits on your washing machine somewhere or like in a filter, whatchamacallit, a AC filter somewhere. Gross areas that shouldn't probably be gross, but that's fine. We'll talk about it later. We'll talk about it next week. That might actually be really useful. So if you're curious about any of those things, please join us next week. We'll drop the link in the chat to register for it. Thank you for that, Roland. And then the March schedule will be open soon, as well as the April schedule, because that is Citizen Science Month. So we're really excited to bring you guys into the world of Citizen Science Month, including those of you who want to participate in iMapInvasives, and iNaturalist, and EdMaps, and WildSpotter. All of those will be featured within our grouping of projects during the month. And so if you need any help getting to any of these resources, if the follow-up email isn't enough, we have more resources. You can also contact Mitchell through the project page by just saying message project. And you can always email us back after the follow-up email for more information. And that's about it. So I'll post that right there, pause that right there. But for any of you who are able to stay a couple seconds after, because it is at the hour, I just want to say thank you so much, Mitchell, for joining us. I'm glad we got to get the lowdown on everything invasive and get a better idea of what it means to work with this data too, because that's often the part that we don't get to hear about as citizen scientists. We'll do some of the volunteer work, but we won't necessarily hear what's actually the result of it. So thank you for sharing all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks everyone for uh, listening to me talk for the last half hour or last hour. Hopefully, I didn't run on and on too much, but thank you all
No,
so
not
much.
at all. Not at all. That was very helpful. I'm excited for this to be on our YouTube as like a workshop on like everything you need to know about invasive species and all
Awesome.
the resources. So yeah, definitely very useful. And for anyone who does have more questions, as I mentioned, feel free to send them. You can also, we will also forward them on to Mitchell if they are specific that might require his help. So thank you all for being here, and we'll see you hopefully next week to talk about slime.